Layla Carter was not someone who believed in fairy tales. She had spent her entire life studying the origins of human culture, and she prided herself on being a skeptic. As a professor of anthropology at a small university in Oregon, Layla often stood in front of her students with a confident smile, explaining why ancient myths were nothing more than imaginative stories created by early humans to make sense of the unknown. To her, gods, monsters, and spirits were simply figments of creative minds. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Layla taught a class called Mythology and Its Origins. On one particular Thursday, as rain pattered against the classroom windows, she leaned casually against her desk and addressed her students. "Think about it," she said, holding up a textbook with a picture of a dragon on the cover. Dragons didn't exist. They were just a way for people to explain natural disasters or powerful storms. And what about gods? They were invented to answer questions like, why does the sun rise? People back then didn't have science, so they made up stories. Her students listened intently, some nodding along while others scribbled notes. But there was always that one student who liked to challenge her. Today, it was a young man named Jake. He raised his hand hesitantly. "Dr. Carter," he began, "what if some of those myths were based on real events? What if people saw something they couldn't explain and turned it into a story?" Layla chuckled softly. "That's an interesting thought, Jake," she replied. "But even if that were true, it doesn't mean dragons or gods actually existed. Humans are storytellers by nature. We take fragments of reality and twist them into legends." She paused, scanning the room. "There's no evidence to support the existence of mythical creatures. None." After class, Layla packed her things and headed to her office. Her colleagues often teased her about her unwavering skepticism. One of them, a history professor named Clara, stopped by her door as Layla sorted through papers. "You know," Clara said with a sly grin, "you're awfully passionate about proving myths wrong, almost like you're trying to convince yourself." Layla frowned. "I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just presenting facts. Myths are fascinating, sure, but they're not real." Clara shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe you're afraid of finding out they are." The comment lingered in Layla's mind long after Clara left. Afraid. That was ridiculous. Layla wasn't afraid of anything. She had built her career on logic and reason, not superstition. Still, the idea stuck with her as she drove home that evening. The streets were slick with rain, and the sky was a deep shade of gray. For a moment, she thought about all the myths she had dismissed over the years. The Greek gods, the Norse legends, the Native American spirits. Could there be any truth to them? No, she decided firmly. It was all nonsense. When she got home, Layla settled into her favorite armchair with a cup of tea. Her cat, Max, curled up at her feet, purring softly. She flipped open her laptop to review some research papers but found herself distracted. Her eyes wandered to the bookshelf across the room, where a collection of folklore books sat untouched. She rarely read them anymore. They were relics from her early days as a student, before she had fully embraced skepticism. Little did Layla know, her life was about to change in ways she could never imagine. The next day, during a walk through Portland's historic district, she would stumble upon something that would challenge everything she believed. But for now, she sat in her cozy apartment, completely unaware that the world of myths she so easily dismissed was far closer than she thought. The next afternoon, Layla decided to take a break from her usual routine. The rain had stopped, and the air smelled fresh and clean. She wandered through Portland's historic district, enjoying the charm of cobblestone streets and old brick buildings. As she turned a corner, something caught her eye. A small weathered sign above a narrow doorway that read *Grayson's Books*. Curious, she stepped inside. The bookstore was dimly lit, with shelves crammed full of dusty volumes. The smell of aged paper and leather filled the air. An elderly man with thinning gray hair stood behind the counter, polishing a pair of glasses. He looked up as Layla entered, and gave her a warm smile. "Welcome," he said in a voice that sounded both gentle and mysterious. "Looking for anything in particular?" Leela hesitated. "Not really. I just saw the sign outside and thought I'd take a look." The man nodded. "Feel free to browse. My name is Mr. Grayson, by the way." He gestured toward the shelves. "You never know what you might find here." As Leela wandered through the aisles, her fingers brushed against spines of books with faded titles. Most of them were ordinary novels, history books, poetry collections. But then, tucked away on a bottom shelf, she spotted something unusual. It was a leather-bound book, its cover cracked and worn. There was no title, but strange symbols were etched into the surface. Something about it drew her in. "Ah, I see you found something interesting," Mr. Grayson said, appearing beside her. His tone was calm, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "That's a rare piece. Very few people come across it." Leela picked up the book and turned it over in her hands. "What is it?" she asked. Mr. Grayson adjusted his glasses. "It's called Asterisk, the Forgotten Lore Asterisk. Some say it contains fragments of ancient knowledge, stories, rituals, even secrets about beings we can't explain. Others think it's just nonsense. Personally, I believe it depends on who reads it." Leela raised an eyebrow. "Beings we can't explain? You mean like mythical creatures?" He shrugged. "Call them what you will. Legends, myths, spirits. The words don't matter. What matters is whether you're willing to explore the unknown." For a moment, Leela considered putting the book back. It seemed absurd, like something out of one of the very myths she dismissed in her classes. But something about it intrigued her. Maybe it was the craftsmanship of the binding, or perhaps it was the strange pull she felt whenever she touched it. Whatever the reason, she decided to buy it. Back at home, Leela placed the book on her desk and stared at it for a while. Max jumped onto the desk, sniffing curiously before curling up beside it. Laughing softly, Leela flipped open the cover. Inside, the pages were yellowed and brittle, covered in handwritten text and intricate drawings. Some sections were written in languages she didn't recognize, while others appeared to be Latin or Greek. She leaned closer, trying to decipher a passage near the beginning. The symbols on the cover seemed to glow faintly under her desk lamp, though she told herself it must have been a trick of the light. Her rational mind fought against the unease creeping into her thoughts. This was just an old book, she reminded herself. Nothing more. But as she continued reading, tiny details began to unsettle her. One illustration showed a shadowy figure standing beneath a blood-red moon. Another depicted a wolf-like creature with glowing eyes, surrounded by runes. At the bottom of the page, a note warned, "Asterisk, beware those who summon what they cannot control." Asterisk. Leela closed the book abruptly, her heart racing. Summon? That was ridiculous. She wasn't some character in a fantasy novel. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the book had affected her somehow. For the rest of the evening, she tried to focus on grading papers, but her mind kept drifting back to the strange volume sitting on her desk. Later that night, as she lay in bed, Leela heard a faint sound coming from her study, a soft rustling, like pages being turned. She froze, listening intently. Surely it was just the wind, or maybe Max playing with something. Yet when she got up to check, the room was empty. The book lay exactly where she had left it, undisturbed. As she returned to bed, Leela told herself she was imagining things. After all, she was a scientist, a rational thinker. There was no such thing as magic or monsters. But deep down, a small part of her wondered if she had made a mistake bringing the book home. Over the next few days, strange things started happening around Lila's apartment. At first, they were so small that she almost convinced herself she was imagining them. Her keys would disappear from the hook by the door, only to reappear hours later on the kitchen counter. Shadows seemed to move when no one was there, shifting unnaturally across the walls even though the light in the room hadn't changed. And then there were the whispers, soft, faint sounds that echoed in the corners of her home late at night. They weren't loud enough for her to make out words, but their presence was impossible to ignore. Leela tried to brush it off as stress or lack of sleep. She had been working long hours grading papers and preparing lectures after all. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every time she looked at the book sitting on her desk, unease prickled at the back of her mind. It was like the air around it felt heavier, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. Still, she refused to believe anything supernatural was going on. She told herself it was just an old book, nothing more. One evening, while sipping tea and trying to focus on a research article, Leela heard a loud thud coming from the study. Her heart skipped a beat. Setting her mug down, she cautiously walked to the doorway. The room was dark, but she could see the curtains fluttering slightly, even though the windows were closed. On her desk, the book lay open, its pages flipping rapidly as if caught in a gust of wind. Yet the rest of the room was perfectly still. "What the?" Leela muttered under her breath. She stepped closer, reaching out to close the book, but stopped short when the pages suddenly stilled. Her eyes fell on a passage written in bold, jagged letters. Though she didn't recognize the language, the symbols seemed to shimmer faintly under the dim light. A chill ran down her spine, and she quickly slammed the book shut. That night, Leela dreamed of a massive figure cloaked in shadow. It stood on a hill beneath a blood-red sky, watching her silently. Its form shifted constantly, too large and too dark to make out clearly. When it moved toward her, the ground trembled and the air grew cold. Leela wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The creature stalked just inches away, its glowing yellow eyes boring into hers. Then, without warning, it let out a low growl that vibrated through her chest. She woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, with her heart pounding wildly. The next morning, Leela decided to confide in someone about what was happening. Her best friend, Emma, had always been practical and grounded, someone who might offer a logical explanation for the strange events. Over coffee at their favorite cafe, Leela hesitated before speaking. "So, weird stuff has been happening at my place," she began carefully. Emma raised an eyebrow. "Weird how?" Leela sighed, choosing her words carefully. "I keep hearing noises, like whispers, and things are moving around when I'm not looking. Plus, I've been having these nightmares." Emma listened patiently, stirring her coffee. When Leela finished, she gave a soft laugh. "Sounds like you're letting that creepy book get to you. Maybe it's time to get rid of it." I know, Leela said, running a hand through her hair. "But it's not just the book. Something feels off, like I'm being watched." Emma frowned. "Okay, this is starting to sound serious. Have you thought about talking to someone? Maybe a therapist?" Leela shook her head firmly. "No way. I'm not losing my mind, Emma. These things are real. I don't know what they mean, but I can't ignore them." Reluctantly, Emma agreed to help. That evening, she came over to Leela's apartment armed with sage and salt. "Just in case," she joked. Together, they searched the rooms, checking for drafts or loose floorboards that might explain the noises. But no matter where they looked, nothing seemed out of place. As they sat on the couch afterward, Leela glanced nervously at the book still sitting on her desk. "Maybe I should throw it away," she admitted quietly. "Do it tomorrow," Emma suggested. "Right now, let's watch a movie and forget about all this spooky stuff." Leela nodded, forcing a smile. But as the night wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that the book wasn't done with her yet. The next day, Leela decided to take Emma's advice and get rid of the book. She grabbed a sturdy box from the closet, wrapped the leather-bound volume in an old towel, and placed it inside. As she carried the box out to her car, she felt a strange weight in her arms, as if the book were resisting being moved. Shaking off the thought, she drove to a nearby park with a large dumpster. But when she opened the trunk, the box was gone. Confused and frustrated, Leela searched her car thoroughly but found nothing. It was impossible. The box had been right there moments ago. She returned home, trying to convince herself that maybe she'd forgotten where she'd left it. But when she walked into her apartment, the book was sitting on her desk again, exactly where she'd left it the night before. That evening, as Leela sat staring at the book, someone knocked on her door. She froze for a moment, startled. No one had announced they were coming over, and she wasn't expecting visitors. Cautiously, she approached the door and peeked through the peephole. On the other side stood a man she didn't recognize. He looked to be in his early 30s with dark hair and sharp features. His expression was calm but intense, like he knew something she didn't. "Can I help you?" Leela asked, opening the door just wide enough to see him clearly. "I think you already have," the man replied, his voice low and steady. "My name is Daniel Hughes. I need to talk to you about that book." Leela instinctively glanced over her shoulder at the desk behind her. "What do you know about it?" Daniel hesitated, then said, "More than you probably want to hear. Can I come in?" Though hesitant, Leela stepped aside, curious despite herself. Once inside, Daniel glanced around the room before turning his attention back to her. "You've been experiencing strange things lately, haven't you? Whispers, shadows moving on their own, dreams that feel too real." Her heart raced. How could he possibly know? "Who are you?" she demanded, crossing her arms defensively. "I'm someone who understands what you're dealing with," Daniel said. "That book, it's not just an old collection of stories. It's tied to something much bigger, something ancient. When you opened it, you awakened something." Leela scoffed, though her hands trembled slightly. "Awakened what?" "A ghost, a monster. Something like that," Daniel admitted. "There are beings, creatures from myths and legends, that most people think are fiction, but they're real, Leela. And some of them don't take kindly to humans meddling with their secrets." She stared at him, torn between disbelief and fear. "You're telling me mythical creatures exist? That's insane." "It's true," Daniel insisted. "And now that you've opened the book, you're a target. Those whispers, those shadows, they're signs. The longer you keep the book, the worse it will get." Leela shook her head, backing away. "This is ridiculous. You can leave now." But Daniel didn't move. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small object, a shiny silver pendant shaped like an eye. "Take this," he said, holding it out to her. "It won't stop whatever's coming, but it might give you some protection." Against her better judgment, Leela took the pendant. It was cool to the touch, and its surface seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Because I've seen what happens when people ignore warnings like this," Daniel replied. "I don't want that for you." As he turned to leave, Leela called after him, "Wait. If all this is true, how do I fix it? How do I make it stop?" Daniel paused in the doorway, his expression grim. "You'll need to learn more about the book. And fast. But be careful who you trust. Not everyone has your best interests at heart." With that, he disappeared into the hallway, leaving Leela alone with the book and a growing sense of dread. That night, Leela couldn't sleep. The pendant Daniel had given her lay on the nightstand beside her bed, glinting faintly in the moonlight. She kept glancing at it, half expecting it to do something, anything, to prove that what he'd said wasn't just some elaborate prank. But it remained still, silent, and ordinary-looking. Yet despite its apparent simplicity, she felt a strange sense of calm whenever her eyes landed on it. For now, that was enough. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the book. It sat on her desk, untouched but somehow more menacing than before. Every time she looked at it, she felt as though it were watching her, waiting for her next move. Daniel's warning echoed in her mind. Asterisk, "You're a target now." Asterisk, was he telling the truth? Could mythical creatures really exist? And if they did, what exactly had she awakened? Curiosity gnawed at her. She told herself she should throw the book away, or better yet, burn it, but she couldn't bring herself to act. Something about it pulled at her, like an itch she couldn't scratch. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear. Either way, she knew she couldn't ignore it forever. Finally, after hours of tossing and turning, Leela gave in. She got out of bed, grabbed the book, and sat at her desk. The pages felt heavier than before, almost warm to the touch. Flipping through them, she noticed sections she hadn't seen earlier, passages written in bold, jagged letters that seemed to shimmer under the dim light. One phrase caught her eye. Fenrisulfur, the devourer of worlds. The name sent a shiver down her spine. Fenrisulf. She recognized it from Norse mythology, a monstrous wolf destined to destroy the gods during Ragnarok. A legend, a story, nothing more, or so she had always believed. Unable to resist, Leela whispered the words aloud. Fenrisulf. At first, nothing happened. Then the temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began creeping across the edges of her desk. The air grew thick, crackling with electricity. Before she could react, the shadows in the corners of the room shifted and coalesced into a massive shape. Leela stumbled backward, her chair tipping over as she fell onto the floor. Standing before her was a creature unlike anything she had ever imagined. It was enormous, easily filling half the room, with fur as black as midnight and eyes that burned like molten gold. Its teeth gleamed like blades, and its growl vibrated through the walls, shaking the very foundation of the building. For a moment, Leela was paralyzed with terror. This wasn't possible. Creatures like this didn't exist. They couldn't. And yet, here it was, staring at her with an intensity that made her feel small and insignificant. The beast let out a low rumble, its voice deep and guttural. "You dare speak my name," it said, each word resonating like thunder. "Do you know what you have summoned?" Leela tried to speak, but her throat was dry. Her hands fumbled for the pendant on the desk behind her, clutching it tightly, as if it might shield her from the nightmare unfolding before her eyes. I didn't mean to," she stammered finally. "I didn't know." The creature tilted its head, studying her with an expression that was both curious and menacing. "Ignorance is no defense," it growled. "You have opened a door best left closed." Before Leela could respond, the pendant in her hand began to glow faintly. The creature recoiled slightly, its glowing eyes narrowing. "So you have allies," it muttered. "This is not over, mortal." And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature vanished. The room returned to normal. The cold dissipated, the frost melted, and the oppressive weight lifted. Leela sat there, trembling, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. It was real. All of it was real. Mythical creatures weren't just stories. They were alive. And now one of them knew her name. The next morning, Leela woke up on the floor of her study, still clutching the pendant. Her body ached from the hard surface, and her mind felt foggy, like she'd been caught in a storm. At first, she thought the encounter with the creature had been a dream, a vivid, terrifying nightmare brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But when she looked at the frost-damaged desk and saw the faint scratches etched into the wood where the creature's claws had touched, reality hit her like a punch to the gut. It wasn't a dream. Fenrisulfur was real. Panic bubbled inside her as she replayed the events of the night. She had summoned a monster, a being straight out of mythology, into her own home. What if it came back? What if it decided she was a threat? The thought made her hands shake so badly, she could barely hold her coffee mug. She needed answers, and fast. Remembering Daniel's warning, Leela dug through her bag for the scrap of paper he'd scribbled his number on. After hesitating for a moment, she dialed it. To her relief, he answered almost immediately. "Leela," he said, his tone sharp with concern. "What's wrong?" "I need your help," she blurted out, her voice trembling. "Something happened last night. Something impossible." Daniel didn't ask questions over the phone. Instead, he told her to meet him at a cafe downtown within the hour. By the time she arrived, she was a bundle of nerves, gripping the pendant tightly in her pocket. Daniel was already there, sitting at a corner table with a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. His expression softened when he saw her pale face and wide eyes. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said dryly. "Worse," Layla replied, sliding into the seat across from him. "I think I summoned one." Over the next 20 minutes, she recounted everything: the glowing text, the freezing air, the appearance of fenrisulfur, and the way the creature had vanished after reacting to the pendant. Daniel listened intently, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "You did exactly what I warned you not to do," he said finally. "You read from the book aloud." "I didn't know." Leela snapped, frustration bubbling over. "How was I supposed to know that would actually summon something?" "It's not just about reading the words," Daniel explained patiently. "It's about intent. When you spoke its name, you gave it permission to enter our world. These creatures, they feed on attention, belief, fear. You opened the door, and now it knows who you are." Leela buried her face in her hands. "What do I do? How do I fix this?" "We need to find someone who knows more about the book," Daniel said. "There's a woman named Margaret Fowler. She's a historian, but she specializes in forgotten lore. If anyone can help us understand what we're dealing with, it's her." They drove to Margaret's house together, a small cottage nestled deep in the woods outside Portland. The elderly woman greeted them warmly, though her sharp eyes hinted at wisdom far beyond her years. After introductions, Daniel explained the situation while Lila showed her the book. Margaret studied it carefully, running her fingers over the cover and flipping through the pages. "This is dangerous," she said quietly. "Very dangerous. This book isn't just a collection of myths. It's a key, a fragment of something much larger. Opening it draws the attention of beings tied to these stories." "Like fenrisulfur," Leela added grimly. Margaret nodded. "Yes, and others. Creatures like him aren't bound by human rules. They exist in liminal spaces, waiting for moments like this to cross over." As they discussed possible solutions, a loud crash echoed from outside. Margaret rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain. Armed men dressed in black tactical gear were approaching the house, their weapons drawn. "They found us," Daniel muttered, standing up quickly. "We need to go. Now." Margaret grabbed a bag filled with notebooks and artifacts, shoving it into Lila's arms. "Take this. It might save your life." Without hesitation, the three of them bolted out the back door, disappearing into the dense forest as bullets shattered the windows behind them. The forest was dark and thick, the trees forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. Lila's heart pounded as she ran, clutching the bag Margaret had given her. Branches whipped at her face, and roots threatened to trip her with every step. Behind them, shouts echoed through the woods. The men in black were close. "Keep moving," Daniel urged, glancing over his shoulder. His voice was calm but urgent, cutting through the chaos like a knife. "We can't let them catch us." Margaret, surprisingly spry for her age, led the way, weaving expertly between trees and ducking under low-hanging branches. She seemed to know the forest well, navigating it like someone who had spent years memorizing its twists and turns. "There's an old hunting cabin not far from here," she called back. "We can hide there until they lose our trail." Leela didn't dare ask how Margaret knew about the cabin or why armed men were chasing them. All she could focus on was putting one foot in front of the other, ignoring the stitch in her side and the burning sensation in her lungs. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made her flinch, convinced they were about to be caught. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they'd reached the cabin. It was small and weathered, barely visible beneath layers of moss and ivy. Margaret pushed open the creaky door, ushering them inside before securing it with a heavy wooden bar. The interior was dim but dry, with a dusty table, a few chairs, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. "We should be safe here for now," Margaret said, setting down her satchel. She pulled out a map and spread it across the table, tracing lines with her finger. They won't find this place easily, but we need to stay alert. Daniel paced the room, his jaw tight with tension. Who are those guys? Hunters. Margaret nodded grimly. Yes. They're part of a secret organization that tracks people meddling with forbidden knowledge. To them, anyone who possesses something like that book is a threat, to themselves and to others. Leela sank into one of the chairs, overwhelmed. Her hands trembled as she opened the bag Margaret had handed her earlier. Inside were journals filled with notes, sketches of symbols, and photographs of artifacts. One page caught her eye, a drawing of the same pendant Daniel had given her, accompanied by a note that read * protects against shadowbound entities *. So this really works, she murmured, holding up the pendant. It does, Margaret confirmed. But it's only temporary. We need to figure out how to seal whatever you've unleashed, or at least weaken it, before it comes back. As they discussed their options, Leela noticed Daniel glancing at her repeatedly, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. You don't have to stay involved in this, Leela. You could walk away right now. I'll make sure you're safe. She shook her head firmly. No, this is my mess. If I hadn't opened that book, none of this would have happened. I'm not running away. Daniel hesitated, then gave a small nod of approval. All right, but things are going to get worse before they get better. Margaret chimed in, pointing to a section of the journal. According to these notes, there's a ritual that might help. It involves binding the creature using runes carved into stone. The problem is finding the right location and the materials needed for the ritual. And time, Leela added quietly. We don't know when Fenrisulfur will come back. Just then, a sharp knock sounded at the door, making everyone freeze. Margaret grabbed a poker from beside the fireplace, while Daniel moved to stand in front of Leela protectively. The knocking came again, louder this time. It's me. A familiar voice called out. Rachel Dawson. Leela exchanged a confused glance with Daniel. Who's that? Before he could answer, Rachel stepped inside, pushing past the barricade with ease. She was tall and athletic, with piercing blue eyes and an air of authority. A scar ran along her jawline, adding to her intimidating presence. In her hand, she held a gun, though she kept it lowered for now. I'm here to help, Rachel said, her tone clipped. But if you try anything stupid, I won't hesitate to shoot. Rachel's sudden appearance sent a wave of tension through the cabin. Leela instinctively moved closer to Daniel, who stood between her and the newcomer. Margaret, however, didn't seem surprised. She studied Rachel carefully, her expression unreadable. You're late, Margaret said finally, lowering the poker she'd been holding defensively. We thought you were with them. Rachel shook her head, tucking the gun into the holster at her side. I'm not with anyone. I work alone. But I heard about the book. And about you three. Figured I'd better step in before things got worse. Who are you? Leela asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. And why should we trust you? Rachel crossed her arms, leaning against the wall, as if she owned the place. My name's Rachel Dawson. I hunt people like you. People who stumble into things they don't understand and end up putting everyone in danger. Normally, my job is to clean up messes like this. But something about your situation feels different. Daniel stepped forward, his tone cautious. Different how? Rachel hesitated, glancing at the bag of journals on the table. That book, it's tied to something bigger than just Fenrisulfur. If it falls into the wrong hands, it could unravel everything. That's why those hunters are after you. They don't care about stopping the creature. They want the book for themselves. Leela felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean, unravel everything? Rachel sighed, running a hand through her short, dark hair. There's a reason these myths were buried. Some truths aren't meant to be uncovered. The book acts as a key, a gateway. Keep using it, and you'll tear holes in the veil between worlds. Trust me, that's not something humanity can survive. Margaret nodded grimly. She's right. We need to act quickly. The ritual might be our only chance to contain the threat. For the next hour, the group worked together, piecing together clues from Margaret's notes and discussing possible locations for the ritual. According to the journals, the rooms needed to be carved into natural stone charged with ancient energy. A mountain range several hours away seemed promising. It matched descriptions of places where similar rituals had been performed centuries ago. As they prepared to leave, Rachel spoke up again. "One more thing. This isn't going to be easy. Fenrisulfur won't let us finish without a fight. And those hunters, they'll be watching every move we make." "We don't have a choice," Leela said firmly. "If we don't try, none of us will be safe." The journey to the mountains was tense and exhausting. By the time they reached the designated spot, a secluded plateau surrounded by jagged rocks, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape. Margaret and Daniel began carving the runes into the flat surface of a massive boulder, while Rachel kept watch, scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. Leela held the pendant tightly, reciting the incantation Margaret had taught her. The air grew colder and the ground trembled slightly. Then, without warning, Fenrisulfur appeared, its massive form blotting out the twilight sky. "This ends now," Rachel said, raising her weapon. "No," Leela shouted. "Let me handle this." Summoning all her courage, she stepped forward, chanting the words louder. The pendant glowed brighter, and the runes on the boulder flared to life. Fenrisulfur roared in fury, lunging toward her. But the magic held strong, binding the creature in place. Just as the ritual neared completion, Rachel noticed movement in the distance. "They're here," she warned. Daniel turned to Leela. "Finish it. I'll hold them off." With tears streaming down her face, Leela completed the incantation. Fenrisulfur let out one last deafening roar before vanishing into nothingness. But the victory came at a cost. Gunfire erupted nearby, and Daniel collapsed to the ground, clutching his side. "Daniel!" Leela screamed, rushing to his side as the others fought to fend off the attackers. "It's okay," he whispered weakly. "You did it." But Leela knew the battle wasn't over. Not yet. The sound of gunfire echoed across the mountainside as chaos erupted around them. Leela knelt beside Daniel, pressing her hands against his wound in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. His face was pale, but he managed a weak smile, trying to reassure her despite the pain. "I'm fine," he murmured through gritted teeth. "Go help Rachel and Margaret." Leela hesitated, torn between staying with him and joining the fight. But she knew he was right. They couldn't afford to lose focus now. With one last glance at Daniel, she grabbed the pendant and ran toward the others, her heart pounding. Rachel and Margaret were crouched behind boulders, exchanging fire with the hunters who had surrounded them. The attackers moved swiftly, their dark uniforms blending into the shadows of the rocks. They were well-trained and relentless, forcing Lila's group to stay on the defensive. "We can't keep this up forever." Rachel shouted over the noise, reloading her weapon. "We need to fall back." Margaret shook her head firmly. "No. If we leave now, they'll take the book, and everything we've worked for will be lost." Leela tightened her grip on the pendant, her mind racing. She couldn't let that happen. Not after everything they'd sacrificed. Summoning her courage, she stepped out from behind cover, holding the glowing pendant high above her head. "Stop," she yelled, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "You don't know what you're dealing with." The hunters paused, surprised by her sudden appearance. One of them, a tall man with cold, calculating eyes, lowered his weapon slightly. "Give us the book," he demanded. "It doesn't belong to you. It doesn't belong to anyone." Lila shot back. "If you take it, you'll destroy yourselves, and maybe the entire world." For a moment, no one moved. Then the leader raised his gun again, aiming directly at her. "I won't ask twice." Before he could pull the trigger, Rachel sprang into action. Moving with lightning speed, she tackled him to the ground, knocking the weapon from his hand. The distraction gave Margaret time to throw a small pouch of powder into the air. It exploded in a flash of blinding light, disorienting the hunters long enough for the group to regroup. "Now," Margaret shouted, pointing to a narrow path leading down the mountain. "Run." They didn't need to be told twice. Supporting Daniel between them, Leela and Rachel hurried down the trail, with Margaret bringing up the rear. Behind them, the hunters recovered quickly, giving chase. Bullets whizzed past their heads, ricocheting off the rocks. As they reached the base of the mountain, Leela spotted an old truck parked nearby. "There," she called out, helping Daniel climb into the backseat. Rachel jumped into the driver's seat while Margaret took the passenger side, and within seconds, they were speeding away. The drive back to civilization felt endless. Daniel drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow. Lila sat beside him, whispering words of encouragement, even though she wasn't sure he could hear her. Guilt weighed heavily on her chest. He had risked everything to protect her, and she didn't know if he would survive. When they finally arrived at a safe house hidden deep in the woods, Margaret tended to Daniel's injuries as best she could. Though the bullet had missed any vital organs, the wound was severe, and he needed proper medical care soon. That night, as Leela sat by the fire, staring into the flames, she felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Grief, anger, determination. She thought about all the lives that had been changed, or lost, because of the book, and she realized something important. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was everyone's. The next morning, Leela stood outside the cabin, looking out at the dense forest. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts until she found names she hadn't spoken to in years, former colleagues, friends, even skeptics like herself. One by one, she sent messages asking for help. By the end of the day, responses began pouring in. Some were hesitant, others curious, but all agreed to meet. Together, they formed a new alliance dedicated to understanding and combating mythological threats. Armed with knowledge, courage, and a shared sense of purpose, they vowed to stand against whatever came next. Leela knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in days, she felt hope, not just for herself, but for humanity. Months passed, and life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm for Leela. The cursed book was locked away in a secure vault, hidden beneath layers of protection designed by Margaret and the growing network of allies. It wasn't destroyed. Leela knew that erasing such dangerous knowledge entirely might be impossible, but it was contained, its power neutralized for now. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that their victory was only temporary. The world of myths they had uncovered wasn't something that could be ignored forever. On a crisp autumn morning, Leela stood atop a hill overlooking the city where her journey had begun. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sky stretched endlessly above her, painted in shades of orange and pink as the sun rose. She clutched a cup of coffee in one hand, her thoughts drifting back to everything she had experienced. The fear, the loss, the moments of hope amidst chaos. Daniel's sacrifice weighed heavily on her mind. Though he had survived his injuries, he chose to step back from the fight, citing the toll it had taken on him both physically and emotionally. "You're stronger than me," he'd said before leaving. "Keep going." And she did. With Margaret's guidance and Rachel's reluctant partnership, Leela built a coalition of researchers, historians, and even former skeptics who were willing to confront the truth about humanity's forgotten past. Together, they studied ancient texts, deciphered cryptic symbols, and developed strategies to weaken the creatures tied to those myths. They weren't warriors or heroes. They were ordinary people stepping up because no one else would. The work wasn't glamorous. Late nights spent poring over dusty manuscripts, heated debates over translations, and endless trial and error experiments became part of their routine. But progress came in small victories. Learning how to disrupt a creature's connection to this world, discovering ways to shield themselves using enchanted artifacts like the pendant, and building alliances with others who understood the stakes. One evening, during a meeting at the safe house, Rachel leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "We've done good work," she admitted grudgingly. But don't think for a second this is over. There are still hunters out there, and worse things waiting to cross over. Leela nodded. I know, but we're ready for them now. We've learned so much already. Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting years of wisdom. Knowledge is our greatest weapon. As long as we keep uncovering the truth, we can fight back. As winter approached, Leela returned to teaching, but her lectures changed. Instead of dismissing myths outright, she encouraged her students to question what they thought they knew. Stories have power, she told them one day. They shape how we see the world. And sometimes, they reveal truths we aren't ready to face. Her colleagues noticed the shift in her demeanor. Gone was the sharp-tongued skeptic. In her place stood someone humbled yet resolute. Clara, the history professor who had teased her months ago, stopped by her office one afternoon. You seem different lately, she remarked. More grounded. Leela laughed softly. Let's just say I've seen things that make me rethink a lot of what I believed. Clara raised an eyebrow. Care to share? Not yet, Leela replied with a smile. But maybe someday. That night, as she sat alone in her apartment, Leela opened a journal and began writing. She documented every detail of her journey. The strange occurrences, the battles fought, the lessons learned. It wasn't just for herself. It was for anyone who might follow in her footsteps. Humanity's myths weren't mere stories. They were warnings. And thanks to Leila's courage, people finally understood why those warnings mattered. Max curled up beside her, purring softly. For the first time in months, Leela felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges she couldn't predict. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had faced the unknown and emerged stronger. And as long as there were others willing to stand with her, she knew they could face whatever came next, together.